Agile and 160 billion gallons when Agile principles occur during a disaster. During a disaster like a flood, natural tendencies gravitate towards a more agile approach, not waterfall. Without intentionality, key agile practices might get overlooked. So here's the plan. We'll start talking about agile concepts within a flood metaphor, highlight critical missing agile practices, and then I'll talk a little bit about personal flood lessons related to agile. Before we get started, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Talking about waterfall. Waterfall model is a sequential design process in which progress is seen as flowing steadily downwards, like a waterfall, through the phases of conception, initiation, analysis, design, construction, testing, production, and maintenance. Agile, on the other hand, is a agile software development describes a set of values and principles for software development under which requirements and solutions evolve through collaborative effort of self-organized cross-functional teams. Now, in terms of our metaphor, there's no way to know if a house will flood or how high the water will rise. And when I'm talking about flooding in this case, I'm talking about rising water, not a storm surge or tidal wave or dam release or anything like that, but where you have some time that you know that flooding might happen. But before I move on, I want to talk about these two pictures, these two triangles. So with a waterfall triangle where it's divided sort of equally across the triangle, notice that you never really end up with a triangle until the equilateral triangle until the very, very end when everything is complete. But in the Agile model where the triangle is divided up more that way, notice that as each iteration grows, you end up with a full equilateral triangle towards the principle of being able to release the most valuable product early and often all the way through Agile. So I really like these triangle models for describing those things. Now a little bit about me, and especially how I'm related to this topic. In 2015, on Memorial Day, my house flooded with 27 inches of water. That was the 162 billion gallons of water that fell over Houston, Texas, hence the name of this slide. 1 year later, on tax day 2016, my house flooded with 13 inches, even though 240 billion gallons of water fell over Houston. And then in 2017, with Hurricane Harvey, my house flooded with -5 inches. We elevated our house one day before. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And Houston had 9 trillion gallons of water. Outside of that, I have over 22 years of software development and 18 years as an Agile advocate. So you can see that each time we flooded, we got better. A lot of that was luck. Some of that was planning and experience and introspection. And I'll use those experiences to talk about this presentation. So just so we're all on the same page, here are some images of my home flooding. And if flooding happens to be a trigger for you, go ahead and close your eyes for the moment. So this is what my house looks like, or looked like, I should say, when it was on the ground. You can see it's a one-story house. There's a nice backyard and a pool and everything. So this is the water starting to come in. This picture on the left is actually one of my favorite pictures. It shows that the water is about a foot deep outside, yet is barely coming in. And then a little bit later, you can see my dog here standing knee deep for her in the water. This is our kitchen. This is pretty close to the final height for Memorial Day. You can see that it's about mid-level of the dishwasher that we had there. And in case anyone was thinking that, oh, well, it's just like giving our sofa a bath or couch a bath, it's actually not. This picture shows you that the water is indeed quite dirty. So the pictures are over if you were blocking the screen for the trigger warning. So while I go through this, if you have flooded, or if you can imagine that these images were of your own house, think about what you would do during a flood. So now the Agile concepts with a flood metaphor. I assert that some of the concepts just naturally occur. It seems silly for them not to. Some of the concepts are partially present, and some of them are rarely applied. And this is all, of course, during a disaster. So here are some of the naturally occurring concepts. Things like the backlog, prioritized backlog, YAGNI, frequent team communication. The backlog, just to define it, is a list of features or tasks which the team maintains and which at any given moment are known to be necessary to complete a project. For me, if we're talking about rising water flooding, Rising water means that I prepare to save our stuff. How would you attack a backlog of your household items during a flood? If this was a live presentation, I would actually be asking the audience that, but since it's not, I will just continue on. So here's a list of ways that you could prioritize during a flood. You could prioritize from the floors to the counters, so basically from the ground up. You could prioritize irreplaceable to common, expensive to cheap, useful to unnecessary, nearest to farthest, front of the house to the back of the house. These are all examples of what people have told me about in terms of the way that they prioritize, given that my entire community did flood. So the answer to this, how should you prioritize your backlog, is from highest value to lowest value. Now you have to be aware of implicit versus explicit prioritization. So what I mean by that is implicit priority is ordering the backlog correlated to easiness or convenience. And actually for Memorial Day, this is what I chose. For Memorial Day, I chose from the floors to the counters, thinking that as the water starts rising in my house, I should clearly remove the things the water's going to encounter first. Those are the things on the floor, and then moving on up from there. I later realized that this was the absolute wrong approach because I ended up saving stuffed toys and schoolwork and just the crap that lives on our ground naturally. And after we had flooded and we had moved out of our house and we got to our apartment, we did not save any of the chairs or mattresses or sofas or places to sit that would have been incredibly useful. I did have a friend who saved nearest to farthest because they had actually had their leg broken before the flood and couldn't move around a lot, so they could only manage to clean up what was near them. But this is implicit priority because it's ordered correlated to easiness. Explicit priority is ordering the backlog correlated to the value that it delivers to the business, in this case, saving your home. This is like irreplaceable to common, expensive to cheap, useful to unnecessary. So during our next flood, our tax day flood, we decided to organize from useful to unnecessary. This is the chairs, the sofas, the tables, things like that. Another concept that occurs fairly easily is Yagni, or you aren't going to need it. This is the mantra that some capability that could be built for the future should not be done now because you aren't going to need it yet. And there are just some things that are not worth saving. Here's a picture of that. Don't waste resources on what you might not need. Again, we saved a lot of stuffed animals that we could have easily gone without. If they had disappeared during the flood, our kids wouldn't have been that upset. So frequent team dialogue or stand-up. This is a kind of a strange one, but this actually occurs kind of naturally. The definition is frequent or regular communication about work accomplished, immediate goals, and blockers. For us, when we're trying to save our stuff, this is X is done, I'm cleaning up Y, I need help moving Z. This was frequent. It wasn't like we had to stand up and we would meet every hour or whatever. This was just like as we're doing things, we kind of had this ongoing conversation. So partially present concepts that happen is the idea of the self-organized cross-functional team and iterations. So a self-organized team is a group of individuals who work together towards a goal, have the ability and authority to make decisions, and readily adapt to changing demands. For us, our kids at the time were 5 and 7, and they worked with very little guidance. We defined the priorities and let them take care of their rooms and their stuff. We basically said, at the time, since we were cleaning up from floor to counters, basically said, we're going to be flooding, water's coming in the house, clean up everything off the floor that you want to save, and let them do that. By the way, this only works if the goal of the product is known and how it supports the business, in this case the household, is defined and is well understood. I'll show an example of where this didn't work later. Cross-functional just means that the team as a whole has all the skills needed to build the product and that each team member is willing to do more than just their own thing. So for us, both my wife and I are strong enough and tall enough to put things up high. Our kids are also expert fort builders and can stack and climb if needed. The next thing that occurs pretty naturally is iterations. Iterations is a repeating set of work to get the job done before reflecting on the progress, objectives, and external influences. Again, I'm kind of using these triangles to show that at each iteration, there is a completed project, but the more iterations that you have, the better the project is going to be. So the idea of an iteration is to produce potentially releasable products. It doesn't mean that the product is going to be released at each iteration, but it is at a done enough state that it could be released and it would have value. So with an indeterminate deadline, with our deadline being water inside the house, the most valuable items are complete and the product is released at that time. So for us, the deadline is water inside the house. If more iterations happen, we have a better product with greater value. But the understanding is that at each iteration could be the last one. And in this case, when water is in the house, the most valuable items from the prioritized backlog are saved. So let me give a concrete example. So again, we learned after Memorial Day, our first flood, that we should prioritize for usefulness, not necessarily from the floor to the ceiling, floor to the counter. So our useful prioritization is working, sleeping, sitting, eating, clothing, and then things like art. So that translates to laptops, mattresses, chairs, tables, other furniture, shoes, and then finally like floor statues. So looking at the triangles, this is kind of what it looks like. Our first iteration is a laptop, then we add the mattresses and the sofa, and then we add the chairs, and then we add the tables, and then we add shoes, and finally we add other things. So if water comes in, let's say after the second iteration, and all we have saved is the mattresses and the sofa, that's highly valuable for when we're in our bare apartment. If, however, we get an extra couple of minutes and we can save some chairs, even better. If after that we can save tables, it's great. And then on and on and on. So this is how iterations build. And then finally, some rarely applied concepts that you'd find during a natural disaster are the demo, the sprint planning, and the retro. Now let me define these first, as I can already see that you're thinking about how this would work during a flood. So a demo, just to define it, is an activity at the end of an iteration where the completed or done product backlog items are demonstrated with the goal of promoting an information-rich discussion between the team members and other stakeholders. So for us, at the end of each iteration, and again, these weren't like 2-hour iterations, this was just like lift a couple of things, that iteration is done, and then let's reassess. So at the end of each iteration, we took photos around the house to see if we had missed anything that should have been saved in that round. So some of taking the photos was to document what we have done, and some of it was just the fact of looking through the camera. We noticed that there was chairs that we had never sat in that we like showed up in the picture. We're like, oh yeah, we should grab those chairs and save those. So during the flooding, the demo was also our chance to post to social media. As I said, we took all these pictures and we were posting to social media just to say, hey, this sucks, we're flooding, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't our intention, but we actually got lots of feedback during the process, which was helpful. People would say, have you called insurance yet? Have you started looking for apartments? I know a good contractor. So that was very valuable feedback to have when we were just solely focused on saving our stuff. The next piece of the Agile puzzle is sprint planning. Sprint planning is defined as a time box meeting where the next highest priority items are reviewed and the team commits to the items which they're going to finish during the next sprint. Now, this is a plan based on the data. So for sprints, you have velocity and burn up and burn down and things like that. But for us, we had the radar, which is the actual weather radar, both current and future, the rain accumulation gauges, bayou water levels, visual checks outside, and social media updates from our neighbors to say how much they were flooding. And so using that, we were able to determine the next round of work. Also asking these questions: does it need to be saved? How is it going to be saved? Where is it going to go? Is refactoring involved? Like, do we already have to move furniture that we've already positioned to accommodate the next things we're going to move? Does anything require 2 or more people? So this was all part of our sprint planning. And then also, we would have retros. And to define a retro, it's during a retrospective meeting, the team reflects on what happened in the iteration and identifies actions for improvement going forward. Now you're thinking, why would you have a retro in the middle of flooding? You should just continue to work and work and work. But there's some really good things that come out of a retro or introspection. So like one, we were running out of high spaces to put things. As you can imagine, high real estate inside of a 1-story house is pretty limited. So giving the time to think about it, we actually had some outside patio furniture that we could bring in to use those as supports. So we took our patio chairs and then we took off the interior doors off the inside of our house and laid them across the chairs to create high platforms. Another problem that we had is our dining room table is pretty large, and it'll keep a lot of things up high, but the legs will be in water. So trash bags and duct tape around the legs. And this is a good one to think about early on before you have to take everything off the table to make this happen. So the critical practices in Agile, I would say, are the demo, the retro, and sprint planning. But why are they the critical practices? Summarizing Agile broadly comes down to transparency, inspection, and adaptation. I'm sure you've probably heard this before. These are the 3 pillars of Agile. So during a crisis or critical deadline, I found from mostly informal polls that the immediate task remains exclusively in focus. Decisions and outcomes lack inspection, and constraints and challenges lack adaptation. So one question to ask yourself is, am I doing the right task? Should I be saving all of the things on the floor first, or are there more important things to save? Am I doing the task right? The countertops already had existing clutter before we even started flooding. Therefore, there was minimal elevated space to save the next iteration of things. Maybe one of the tasks should have been, we should clean off all the counters before we start lifting things, so that way there's space for us. Can I do this task better? Can I save countertop space if the couch spans from the sink to the kitchen island? And think about where these items fit, instead of just trying to pile them all up on top of each other. How can I adapt to a challenge? For example, the kids can't lift furniture. Again, they were 5 and 7 at the time. But we can have them on documentation and have them take pictures of everything. Now, I did learn that you should give them very clear instructions because I had about 300 pictures of a blur through my house as they just held the shutter down. But they were able to take some documentation once I corrected that. Moving on to planning questions. How do I navigate a constraint? So we were running out of raised real estate inside the house, and so we could bring in our outside chairs and use doors for makeshift tables. What should I do next that adds the most value? Maybe I should pack a to-go bag in case I can't stay at my house tonight. That was a very insightful thing that someone from Facebook told us that we should do. So these are critical because no matter what the crunch of the deadline is, time needs to be taken to inspect and to adapt. So now let's talk about some of the personal lessons that I have learned from flooding several times. Talk about waterfall versus the Agile struggle, self-organized versus non-enrolled teams, explicit prioritization, following the plan, and showing the team the value. Again, there's going to be some pictures coming up, so just a trigger warning for that. So the idea that everything is equally important. So I would assert that if you try to save everything in your house without priority, this means that failure is certain. I would assert that the idea that everything is equally important, that feels like waterfall to me. Everything must be done for this project. And if you can't prioritize, failure is certain to happen. The picture that you see here is a middle page from my insurance claim document. There are over 1,500 items in my insurance claim. This is from Memorial Day, first flood, that I didn't save. 1,500 items, because my mentality was we're going to try to save everything and we'll just do it from the floor up. So we did not save 1,500 items. Non-enrolled team. So as I mentioned, to have a self-organized, cross-functional team, the team needs to be enrolled in the goal of what the product is. In our case, our product is saving our stuff or protecting the house, ensuring our safety. In 2015, we did not get to the self-organized state. It's hard to actually tell what's going on in this picture, so let me kind of clear out the background a little bit. Here in the middle of our dining room table, we had an exchange teacher who was staying in our garage apartment, which was also on the ground, during Memorial Day. The Memorial Day flood happened very early in the morning. It's about 2 or 3 in the morning. So once I knew we were flooding, I went out to wake her up. I basically knocked on her door, and she answers the door, still half asleep. And she's like, "What do you want?" And then she realized that she was standing ankle deep in water. I said, "Great, you're informed. I'm going to go back to saving our stuff." Now, she could have chosen anything to do. She could have saved her stuff. She could have helped us save our stuff. Clearly, there was a frenzy in the house of picking up things. She could have comforted our kids who were freaking out a little bit and they were on the top bunk of their bed. Many, many things that she could do. But she chose to fall asleep on our most valuable piece of real estate on our dining room table. You can see us, for whatever stupid reason, trying to stack things around her and not wake her up or push her into the water. But clearly she did not understand the goal of the team. So implicitly prioritizing the backlog. As I said, for Memorial Day, we tried to prioritize from the floor up, saving anything that we could. And this we failed to deliver most valuable product. We saved Legos that were on the floor, homework, backpacks. And you can see here, this is a picture of our dining room. There's like artwork on our buffet here on the right side. There's a backpack on a chair. The chairs are already halfway underwater. We didn't save anything of value. Everything that we did save was thrown away shortly after we flooded. But the next time we flooded, we actually had a plan, and we followed the plan. And we adapted the plan at the iteration boundaries. So this is getting ready for tax day. There's actually, you can see a sheen of water on the floor already. But for tax day, our plan was we clean. Anytime that there was going to be a major storm, we would clean the house. We would make sure that the countertops were clean, laundry was put away, dishes were put away. So that way, if we did need to lift our furniture, we had clear surfaces for that. If we didn't need to lift our furniture because the rain passed or it wasn't as bad as they were expecting, we ended up with a clean house, and it was win-win. Then the next step in our plan was to prepare. This meant that, based on our data and based on the radar and predictions and things like that, this would mean we would start bringing in the outside furniture. We would start building the raised shelves. We didn't actually lift anything at this point, but we were ready to. Again, if we didn't flood, we wasted some effort moving the outside furniture in and some effort taking the doors off the hinges, but not a lot of effort in terms of lifting our furniture and rearranging our whole house. Then finally, if water was for our limit, like halfway up the driveway, we started lifting our furniture. Again, going through our prioritized backlog, lifting our sofas and mattresses first, followed by our chairs, and then tables, and then anything else, we could do that. And then finally, the water's inside the house, and we should have everything lifted. To our credit, our tax day flood, which was only 13 inches, we didn't lose anything we weren't prepared to lose. We saved everything that we wanted to. So our plan worked. Our plan was a 12-inch flood plan, and we got 13 inches, so we were very, very lucky in that regard. Had we used the same plan with Hurricane Harvey, had we not lifted our house, we would have failed miserably because Hurricane Harvey would have been 54 inches of water. So in terms of following the plan, watch out for the siren songs. Watch out for things that draw you away from executing your plan that you're currently on, your iteration that you're currently on. Here you can see that we have some pots and pans floating in the water. It would be easy to save those, thinking that they're already in the water and we should save them, but they're pots and pans. They have experienced things way dirtier than this flood water that is here and will be easy to clean. So we should ignore those as we're proceeding on with lifting the important things. And then show the value to the team. So as I'll show you a picture here in a moment, but we actually elevated our house, lifted our entire house off the ground as our final solution to our flooding problem. Now, as I said in the introduction, we flooded -5 inches for Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey actually hit Houston on a Thursday. It started raining on Friday. We knew about it starting on Monday. Now, we were actually supposed to lift our house 1 week later. So Hurricane Harvey was coming 1 week before we were actually supposed to lift. So our house was prepped and ready to go. I reached out to our contractor and said, is there anything we can do to get the lift to happen earlier or faster? And they pulled in teams from San Antonio and Austin and New Orleans. There was about 50 people there, and they were able to lift our house the day that it started raining. Now, up until this point, this crew, this team that goes around lifting houses after a flood had never actually understood the impact that they had on people's lives. Because normally the process is the house floods, they want to be lifted out of the floodplain, and so this crew comes in, lifts the house, and then hopefully it never floods again, and they go about their business. But for them, because we lifted before Harvey, they were actually, and like we only got the first part of the lift done. They weren't able to do all of the lift, just enough to barely get above the water. They were actually able to come back and see the impact that they had on our lives, which the CEO of the company said that had never happened before. They had never actually understood the value that they delivered. So that was a pretty cool thing. So some final thoughts on this. During a tight deadline, remember to be intentional with all of the Agile practices. The demo provides transparency. The retro facilitates adaptation. Planning utilizes inspection. And all three of those together are Agile. Now I do want to show you a time lapse of our house. So here is the house actually being lifted off the ground. This is a 2-day time lapse separated by 1 month. So they were able to lift the house about 4.5 feet. This was the day before Harvey. And then you can see that this big shift that just happened right here, they're lifting it the full height to 10 feet off the ground. And it's pretty incredible engineering to see them lift an entire house. It's done safely. There's very, very little disruption in terms of like leveling the doors or foundation or anything like that. But you can see here that the house is now up. And then if I go to the next slide, this is what our house looks like today. So it's safe out of the water. This is a 1-story house that is 10 feet off the ground. Here is the back of our house. We've left the bottom open, so that area around the pool is like a cabana space and a fun play space. There's an outside kitchen. And with that, I will go ahead and take some questions. Thank you so much for attending the session, and I'll be chatting with you live here shortly.